Picture this: three men in hybrid cars, driving 500 miles through a snowstorm to beg for survival. Not criminals on the run, not refugees fleeing disaster, but the CEOs of General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, the very titans who once made America synonymous with the automobile. Just weeks earlier, they'd flown private jets to Washington asking for billions. The backlash was so fierce they had to drive back like common citizens, humble and desperate. This wasn't just a PR stunt. This was the funeral procession of American automotive dominance. And the question that should haunt every American is this: how did the country that invented mass production, that put the world on wheels, that built an entire culture around chrome and horsepower, how did it lose everything to rivals it once looked down upon? The answer will shock you, because it wasn't about bad luck. It was about choices. Deliberate, calculated choices that sacrificed your wallet for their profit margins. In late 2008, amid the gray cold of the Midwest and the desperate energy of a collapsing economy, those three automotive chiefs made their pilgrimage to Washington in hybrid models: a Chevrolet Malibu, a Ford Escape, and a Chrysler Aspen. The symbolism was almost too perfect. Just 1 month before, they'd been crucified in the court of public opinion for arriving in private jets, leather-seated kings begging for taxpayer money, while ordinary families wondered how they'd make next month's mortgage payment. The optics were catastrophic, so they drove, all 500 miles, through the heartland that had once worshipped at the altar of Detroit steel. These weren't just any companies. This was the Big Three, the industrial holy trinity that had dominated global automotive production for generations, that had transformed American streets into theaters of power and freedom. The land where Henry Ford didn't just build the Model T, he revolutionized how the entire world worked, introducing assembly line production that defined a century. And now, on their home turf, they were dying. So let me ask you this: have you ever believed a promise from someone who had no other choice? Remember your answer, because what happens next will either vindicate your skepticism or prove you were right to doubt all along. Rewind to the 1960s. The landscape began its tectonic shift when a U.S. government tightened its grip on emissions and safety standards, transforming automotive production from a pure horsepower contest into a complex calculation of engineering constraints. These new requirements attacked harmful emissions directly, mandating that by 1975, hydrocarbons and nitrogen oxides had to be slashed by over 50% compared to earlier levels. Automakers had to choke their engines, completely rethink their approach, quietly ending the golden age of muscle cars. They didn't vanish entirely, but the era of raw, unchecked power was over. While Detroit wrestled with regulations and mounting costs, something quietly revolutionary happened in 1958. Japanese cars slipped into America almost unnoticed. The Toyota Crown arrived first, a small footnote that would become a chapter, then a volume. Honda, Nissan, Mitsubishi, Mazda followed, one careful step at a time, building trust through reliability rather than flash. Small, practical, unexciting cars that simply worked. Then the 1970s delivered two oil crises like hammer blows to the American psyche. Suddenly, Americans who had built their identity around big engines and open highways found themselves calculating every gallon, every mile. And in that exact moment of vulnerability, Japanese cars surged forward on the strength of fuel economy and low operating costs. Within a few short years, Japanese vehicles sold in America went from curiosities to mainstream choices, climbing into the millions by 1980. The Big Three made a catastrophic strategic error. Instead of fighting to reclaim the small car market, they increasingly leaned on trucks and crossover SUVs, where policy loopholes and profit margins were more generous. They surrendered the passenger car segment piece by piece, like chess players sacrificing pawns without realizing they were losing the game. The result? By 2006, all 10 best car picks selected by Consumer Reports belonged to Japanese automakers. Not one American car made the list. It was a report card left on America's kitchen table. Impossible to ignore, impossible to deny. And then there was labor, the sensitive wound that never healed. Labor costs, particularly benefits locked into union contracts, added significant weight to the price of American-made vehicles. While exact figures vary, the structural difference was clear. Many Japanese automakers operated U.S. plants with more flexible models, less constrained by legacy union frameworks, more adaptable to cost pressures. Quick question for you. What was your first car? An old Toyota or Honda that refused to die? Or an American car that taught you the meaning of check engine light? Drop your answer in the comments. Fast forward to 2008. This wasn't just about falling sales. This was the moment the American economy felt like someone had cut the power cord. The automobile, the second largest asset for most families after their home, instantly transformed from essential to optional. As recession spread from Wall Street to Main Street, new car sales plummeted nearly 40% from 2007 to 2009. Assembly lines that had hummed like clockwork for decades sputtered and stopped. This collapse was intimately connected to the housing crisis. For years, American homes had functioned as personal ATMs. Families borrowed against home equity to finance major purchases, including vehicles. Financial surveys from 2006 showed roughly 24% of homeowners had used home equity lines to buy cars or trucks. When the housing bubble burst, that money pipeline shut off completely, and car buying power evaporated with it. When sales cratered and cash reserves dried up, the automakers painted an apocalyptic picture. If one of them collapsed, the domino effect would obliterate suppliers, dealerships, and hundreds of thousands of jobs across the entire economic chain. Finally, the government intervened. President George W. Bush announced an emergency loan of approximately $17.4 billion to prevent total collapse. The next administration continued with deeper interventions and forced restructuring. But understand this clearly. The bailout wasn't charity. It was a binding contract that forced the Big Three to strip away their excess and become leaner companies capable of surviving in America that had fundamentally changed. General Motors went through restructuring bankruptcy, splitting into a new entity while shutting down brands that had once been American icons: Hummer, Saturn, Pontiac. Saab was pushed out entirely. Chrysler's path forward came through a government-brokered alliance with Fiat, designed to give Chrysler better product platforms and technology while focusing on brands with stronger cash flow: Dodge, Jeep, and Ram. Ford took a different route, the path of stubborn independence. They refused direct bailout money but paid the price anyway, selling off luxury brands like Aston Martin, Jaguar, and Land Rover, shrinking to survive, then pivoting towards smaller, more mainstream models. On paper and in public statements, all three companies made the same solemn promise. They would pivot towards smaller, more fuel-efficient, more practical cars. Detroit had finally learned its lesson, or so they said. 10 years passed. Americans who had watched those CEOs drive through the snow, who had accepted the bailout as necessary, believed they had earned a new chapter. Affordable, fuel-efficient passenger cars for the middle class, just as the social contract had quietly promised. Then in 2018, Ford dropped a bombshell. The company announced it would stop producing most passenger cars in the U.S. market, keeping only the Mustang. That single decision felt like a scene from a tragic film, where only one symbol remains as a memorial, while everything practical and everyday is quietly buried. The Fusion, Fiesta, and Focus disappeared, not because Americans stopped needing affordable cars, but because they no longer delivered the profit margins Ford demanded. Suddenly, the promise to focus on small, practical cars revealed its true nature. It was never about meeting America's transportation needs. It was about clinging to whichever market segment generated the fastest, biggest profits. Chrysler's pivot happened even earlier and more decisively. Around 2016, the Dodge Dart and Chrysler 200 were discontinued. The passenger car lineup shrank like a room being emptied of furniture. What remained were emotional, traditional names like the Challenger and the 300. Cars for ordinary families were no longer the priority. General Motors took a slower approach, but the result was identical. Throughout the 2000s, familiar passenger car models exited the stage one by one. The Impala, Cruze, Volt, and eventually the Malibu. With each cancellation, everyday buyers watch their choices shrink and the path to affordable transportation grow steeper and more expensive. All three converged on the same strategy: retreat to crossovers and trucks where profit margins were fatter, where they held competitive advantages, and where regulatory loopholes let them breathe easier. But the price of that retreat was devastating. The passenger car market was abandoned, and consumers were forced to adapt to a new reality. When those affordable small models were killed off, the cheap, simple new car, once the gateway to middle-class mobility, became a rare commodity. And what filled the gap wasn't better passenger cars. It was vehicles that were bigger, taller, heavier, and significantly more expensive. The right to transportation at a reasonable cost was quietly stripped away, not through legislation, but by making the affordable choice disappear from the showroom floor. Look at the surface, and you'll see an America that naturally loves crossovers and trucks, as if it's purely cultural preference shaped by long highways, harsh winters, weekend adventures, and hauling needs. But dig deeper into the structure, and you'll discover something more sinister. Demand wasn't just organic. It was sculpted by how laws define vehicle categories, how protective tariffs work, and how profit motives guided the big three's every decision. The share of light trucks in a market grew steadily until it accounted for nearly 80% of sales. Here's the critical detail. The legal definition of truck doesn't match what most people imagine. As long as a vehicle has higher ground clearance, can carry people and cargo, or is marketed as off-road capable, it can cross that definitional threshold fairly easily. The corporate average fuel economy standards, created in the 1970s to force efficiency improvements after the oil crisis, split vehicles into two categories: passenger cars and light trucks, with light trucks given more lenient requirements. That gap created a golden opportunity. If a model qualified as a light truck, the automaker could meet fuel economy standards more easily than with an equivalent passenger car. The door opened even wider when the light truck definition covered vehicles under a certain weight threshold, often around 6,000 pounds, and allowed configurations designed to carry both people and cargo. Crossovers and many car-like models that simply stood taller could slip into this category, transforming a technical classification into a strategic weapon. Even before fuel economy standards, there was another layer of protection dating back to 1964, the chicken tax. High tariffs on imported trucks unintentionally turned the truck segment into a fortress where domestic automakers were better shielded from outside competition. They made doubling down on trucks even more attractive. And then there's profit, the real compass guiding every decision. A crossover or truck can command significantly higher prices than a passenger car, while production costs don't rise proportionally. In plain terms, on the same platform, in the same factory, just by raising the ride height, widening the body, and adding a few features, an automaker can create a product with substantially thicker profit margins. Here's where the trap closes tight. Once the big three tasted those profits from trucks and crossovers, they had even less incentive to invest in passenger cars. When they neglected passenger cars, rivals had even more opportunity to dominate that segment. The long-term consequence? Market share eroded to around 40%. By 2024, aggregated data from U.S. Traffic Safety Agency recall reports showed that vehicles under Stellantis and Ford were among those with the highest number of recalls. This wasn't about isolated incidents anymore. It felt like wave after wave hitting owners. Moving into 2025, when reliability rankings were published, the leading brands continued to lean heavily toward Asian automakers, while Detroit brands failed to appear in the top tier, where everyday buyers look for peace of mind. But statistics don't destroy trust. Stories do. The kind you only discover after you've already bought the vehicle. Stellantis carries a stain from its Fiat Chrysler days that won't wash off. The company was accused of using emissions control cheating software on certain 2014 to 2016 Jeep and Ram diesel vehicles, leading to settlement agreements. Massive remediation programs, including owner compensation and mandatory repairs. Then General Motors suffered a devastating blow in 2025 to an icon of American power. The 6.2-liter V8 L87 engine in full-size vehicles faced a recall of nearly 600,000 vehicles in the U.S. due to risks of internal component failures that could cause stalling, loss of propulsion, and crash danger. Investigative reports cited tens of thousands of field complaints, along with crashes and fires. Before the dust settled, the U.S. Traffic Safety Agency opened or expanded investigations because reports suggested the previous remedy might not have fully solved the problem. This shifted the narrative from technical defect to trust crisis. If it's already been fixed, why are owners still worried their vehicle will become a gamble after 100,000 miles? In that context, Stellantis revealed a paradox that's difficult to swallow. In 2023, the company posted record results with net profit around 18.6 billion euros, nearly brushing 20 billion. During that same period, the CEO's total 2023 compensation was reported at 36.49 million euros, roughly $40 million. A number that sounds like it belongs to a different universe if you're an owner who just received a recall notice. While the company reported record results and paid shareholders billions through dividends and buybacks, workers and car buyers heard endless news about cuts, strikes, cost pressures, and complaints that quality was declining while vehicle prices climbed. It created the unmistakable sense of short-term strategy. Squeeze everything dry to make the financial statements sparkle. Meanwhile, companies that got ahead in the EV era took a different approach. Tesla built everything from scratch on its own terms and remains the dominant force in the US EV market. Recent industry reports show Tesla still accounts for nearly half of EV sales in America. Rivian chose the path of an all-American electric truck, targeting customers willing to pay premium prices for electric crossovers and pickups designed like serious adult toys. Though its scale remains far below mass-market automakers, Rivian recorded full-year 2024 deliveries exceeding 51,000 vehicles, proof it's no longer just an experiment. Foreign rivals didn't stand still either. Hyundai and Kia demonstrate how Asian automakers steadily held ground in the mainstream EV market with deep product lineups and consistent launch momentum. Even when growth fluctuates with yearly incentive policy changes, they remain strong enough that every domestic automaker has to look over their shoulder nervously. Honda entered the bigger game with the Prologue electric model that started selling in 2024. Notably, it didn't follow a showpiece strategy. It was pushed into the market as a genuine product aimed at winning real customers in the fiercely competitive electric crossover segment. But the blow Detroit found hardest to swallow didn't come from EVs. It came from a changing of the guard on home soil. In 2024, for the first time in decades, the top-selling vehicle in the U.S. based on new vehicle registration data was no longer the Ford F-150. That crown belonged to the Toyota RAV4, a Japanese crossover that sells exceptionally well in America and is also assembled in North America, beating the F-150 by a margin large enough to mark this as a historic shift rather than random fluctuation. In that moment, the bitter paradox became crystal clear. The segment Detroit had clung to most desperately for years, crossovers and trucks, was no longer safe territory. Rivals had learned how to build exactly what Americans want, and then made it more durable, more fuel efficient, and more consistent. If you think this story deserves deeper investigation, subscribe to this channel to keep following this series about the American auto industry. And here's the closing question to end like a film scene with the garage door sliding shut. In your view, 10 years from now, will the big three, General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis, still exist intact? Or will EV makers like Tesla, along with a new wave of Asian and global competition, gradually swallow them piece by piece until they're just memories of what American manufacturing used to be? Leave your prediction in the comments. See you next time.